Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Natalie Fenton. I'm a Professor of Media and Communications here at Goldsmiths, and I'm also Chair of the Media Reform Coalition. A conference on The Guardian simply wouldn't be complete without hearing from the former editor of The Guardian for 20 years, Alan Rusbridger. The person probably most responsible for The Guardian, many of us in the conference know best. So we are delighted this morning to welcome Alan to the conference. Alan's own brief biography states that he was editor-in-chief of The Guardian from 1995 to 2015. He's currently principal of Lady Margaret Hall at Oxford University, where he's also chair of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. During his time at The Guardian, both he and the paper won numerous awards, including the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism. The Guardian grew from a printed paper with a circulation of 400,000 to a leading digital news organisation with 150 million browsers a month around the world. He launched the now profitable editions in Australia and the US, as well as a membership scheme which now has 1 million Guardian readers paying for content. And Gary Young mentioned yesterday, I think, if I get this right, that was bringing in about £69 million a year. His memoir of journalism and its future, Breaking News, was published in 2018. And more recently, his A to Z of News and How to Use It was published in 2020. He's also a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. The title of Alan's talk today is More Than a Business, the 200-year history of a newspaper which put purpose before profit. That's a very interesting title, and we might expect it to say the public before profit. But rather we have an explicit emphasis here on purpose. So I'm very intrigued to discover precisely how that purpose was and maybe is being defined and enacted in the practices of its news production. We ended yesterday's plenary talking about contradictions, and I just briefly want to mention this so that we get a continuation of our conversation. Gary Young, in his chapter on the book that accompanies this conference, states that The Guardian has a historic relationship to liberal values. Des Friedman goes on to say in the same book that this commitment to liberalism and serving a market for educated liberals is explicitly hostile to transformative social change. The book discusses how we can see this in its increasingly risk-averse responses to things like the security state that Mark Curtis outlined yesterday, its coverage of Corbyn that Gary Young spoke about, and its ultimate rejection of things like the Leveson framework for press regulation, despite exposing the illegality that led to the inquiry in the first place. And that will be presented in a panel after this. So is The Guardian's purpose wrapped up in what Gary Young referred to as liberalism with a small L and conservatism with a small c, that leaves it ultimately colluding with power rather than holding it to account while purporting to do something else? That's the question. So I'm very much looking forward to finding out. Please continue the conversations we were having at the end of yesterday. Use the chat as much as you possibly can. Alan is going to talk for 35 to 40 minutes, after which we should have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So keep the chat going as Alan presents. Our wonderful volunteers will collect the questions together and I'll be putting them to Alan at the end. Please note as well that this session is being recorded. Alan, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Can you hear me? And only once. That's even better. I'm going to try and share my screen, and if that works, then we're in business. Now I can't see anybody, but I'm hoping somebody will shout and say, yes, I can see your slide. Yes? Somebody tell me.
I can't, Alan.
You can't, right? Okay.
Yes, we're there.
Yes?
Yes, we're there, Alan.
Okay. Okay. Well, look, thank you for coming along on 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. That's above and beyond. I want to celebrate this moment of the Guardian's bicentenary. A tiny number of companies, a handful of the FTSE, make it to 200, and almost no companies make it to 200 years, essentially in the same ownership. And I think the irony is that the Guardian has never been much of a business. I think anyone would tell you that in conventional terms, It has never made anybody rich. It's seldom made huge profits, indeed not always made profits. The owners, far from making themselves rich, gave the paper away, and its history is littered with financial crises and near-death experiences. And yet here it is. It's still here. It's 200 years old. Happy birthday to The Guardian on May the 5th. It's got around £1 billion in the bank. It's accessed, according to the latest figures, by 1.5 billion browsers around the world. And all this is not bad for something that started being hand cranked on a press that could manage only 125 copies an hour. I'm speaking, as you heard from Natalie, as somebody who edited it for 20 years. I worked for the best part of 40 years on the paper. And as was mentioned yesterday, all you're told when you become editor of The Guardian is to keep going as heretofore. So each editor has to interpret what those words are, and they have to think about where the paper came from, what its traditions are, and that does require some understanding of what that history is. So I'm going to briefly highlight some of the things that I suppose spoke to me from The Guardian's history when I approached the task of being editor, and try and understand some of the secret for the longevity. What explains the fact that The Guardian, but despite not being much of a business, is still here and still thriving. It was the first edition was published on the day that Napoleon died, although The Guardian didn't get around to reporting it for about 2 months. This was the days before breaking news alerts. And I'm just going to canter through some of the stories that, as you think about what The Guardian has seen and said, just a few of them that strike me when you go back and read. It was there in 1830 when William Huskisson fell under the wheels of the rocket, and an extraordinary 2,000-word, very vivid, almost too vivid description of his death. It was there throughout the agitation over the Reform Bill. It was there deploring fake news about the Indian Mutiny in 1857. It lurched to the left in the 1880s and got behind Gladstone and Home Rule. There's a wonderful description of Queen Victoria's 50th anniversary garden party, another tradition of The Guardian, I think, which is just beautiful writing. Scott, in his lurch to the left, became very anti aspects of empire and scathing about Cecil Rhodes. That was the judgment on Cecil Rhodes when he died in 1902. And people who talk about rewriting history as Cecil Rhodes don't need to take any lessons from The Guardian and its judgment on Cecil Rhodes at the time. J.M. Singh wrote about Irish poverty in 1905. It had a reporter on the beach at Gallipoli in 1916. It made it to the Easter Rising in the same year. And its photographer, Walter Doughty, one of the first, certainly the first photographer to work for The Guardian, went back to go to Ireland in the 1920s and took a quite remarkable series of pictures about the Irish Civil War. It was very pro-suffragist, if not suffragette. Wonderful letters from Emmeline Pankhurst to C.P. Scott in the Manchester Archive, berating him for being so squeamish about supporting bomb throwing. Arthur Ransom, the author of Swallows and Amazons, wrote on famine in the Volga in the 1920s. A remarkable correspondent, F.A. Voigt, was in Germany in the 30s, then later from Paris. It sent Martha Gellhorn to Vietnam in 1966. Culturally, it was there to hear Paganini play in Manchester in 1832. George Fremantle, its music critic, was there describing Wagner at the first Bayreuth Festival in 1876. Extraordinary 8-hour interview with Tolstoy in 1905. A much shorter interview with Lenin in 1919. And it was there to watch the prototype of the Baird TV in 1930, which was launched rather amazingly with a play by Pirandello, and The Guardian was reluctant to dismiss the medium altogether. C.L.R. James, a wonderful cricket writer in the 1930s and again in the 1950s, hired by Neville Cardus, possibly the first black professional sports reporter in British history. And I end with, in 1938, with Neville Chamberlain and the Guardian's verdict on him, which was not to believe him. So the thing that strikes me about that tiny a sample of the Guardian's reporting is what a lot it's seen, what a lot it's had to say, how much of it was international. This was a Manchester paper, if you imagine the East Anglian Daily Times or the Bristol Post or the Northern Echo having such a voice and such confidence to go out into the world and report, I think it tells you about the ambitions for the paper and maybe one of the reasons for its success, that it grew to be much larger in its editorial ambitions, and its voice was listened to nationally and internationally. But I guess one of the main arguments that I want to advance today is that the primacy of reporting. You'll all know 100 years ago, C.P. Scott wrote a very famous centenary essay in which he talked about facts being sacred. Comment is free, facts are sacred. And I think that was a bit of a clue as to where the greatest editor of The Guardian thought the priorities of a newspaper should lie. And maybe I think it resonates loudly today when we live in an age of information chaos. And the greatest priority, it seems to me, is simply understanding what is true and what isn't true, what happened, what didn't. And after 4 years of Trump, if we don't understand how frightening it is to live in a society in which we simply don't know what happened, then I think we're not learning the lessons of history. That, of course, takes us to the seminal event that led up to the launch of The Guardian, and I was interested to read Des Friedman writing about it. I think he thinks The Guardian rather over-eggs the link with Peterloo. I'm not sure that's true. I think that Peterloo is the reason The Guardian was founded. But maybe we can both agree, Des and I, that actually it wasn't so much that The Guardian wanted to get behind the radical demands of Orator Hunt and some of the people who were agitating for reform. It was really a simple question of establishing what had happened. You had this extraordinary thing that had happened in the middle of the second greatest city in Britain at the time. And it was really important to know what had happened. What was the truth? Who do you believe in a world of fake news? It's a very contemporary question. And it's wonderful to watch the recent Mike Leigh film about Peterloo and the fact that he could, and we as students of history know so much about what happened on the day. Basic questions, was it a peaceful march? Was the riot Red Act? Who gave the orders to attack the crowd? And I think it must have been apparent then, as must be apparent now, that unless you have agreed facts, you can make no progress. There can be no justice. You can't move on. And so on August the 16th, 1819, as soon as the dead and the injured had been taken away or cared for, the main priority was for an accurate account of what had happened, and that had to be circulated, and so that people could agree before you could then work out how to make sure these things never happened again. That brings us to John Edward Taylor. So he was a Manchester businessman who had dabbled in journalism. He was there on the day, and he knew that the main reporter that had been sent from London, John Tyas from the Times, was out of action. Whether he was arrested or whether he sought sanctuary, we don't really know. And it was Taylor and Jeremiah Garnett and Archibald Prentice, three of the reporters who were there from Manchester at the time, or witnesses, who decided they had to get the facts to the Times. So they sat down and wrote it that afternoon. And the great editor of the Times, Thomas Barnes, was waiting for the account. And the moment it arrived, he slapped it in the paper on August the 18th, 1819, in the absence of the report from his own man on the ground. And it's fascinating. I've gone back to read the Times over the subsequent days. seeing an editor trying to work out, well, how do you get people to agree what the truth was? And he used what we might think of as some very modern techniques. He used what today I think we would call crowdsourcing. So as many people as he could get in touch with, and people who wrote letters and accounts, he put them in to build up a kaleidoscope of history. He used what we would today call aggregation, i.e. he took accounts from other newspapers and said, well, here it is. Not all of them agreed, but he was confident enough within a day or two, and once Tyus had managed to escape and file his report, to start talking about the words fact. He used the words fact, the dreadful fact, to say that these people were unarmed and they were mown down by the cavalry. Of course, the important thing really was to work out whether there had been any provocation from the crowd. And again, the Times was able to say with confidence, within days of this happening, that not a brickbat was thrown, not a pistol was fired. Well, what was the importance of all this? Why did it matter? The very good centenary history of The Guardian, published in 1921 by Haslam Mills, who was the chief reporter, was that narratives appeared in print within 48 hours of the massacre, which got ahead and were never overtaken by the official version. So they knew that the magistrates would come out and tell lies. They would get their version at the Home Office, and they knew that the truth really mattered. And the great historian E.P. Thompson, writing in 1957, said that never since Peterloo has authority dared to use equal force against a peaceful British crowd. And there is Haslam Mills really talking about how Peterloo is the debut of the reporter in English public life, this invaluable role that the reporter has, just bearing witness, being independent of all forms of power. And that really is the most important function, I think, of journalism, and maybe needed today more than ever. It's not to downplay the importance of opinions. They matter too. But I think we might all agree that opinions without facts count for little. So 1819, and within 18 months, a group of mainly non-conformist businessmen in Manchester undertake to finance the Manchester Guardian. And the most significant thing to me is that to them, they weren't in it to make money. And that, I think, seems odd to many people today. There was no question of a quick exit or a lucrative IPO. They wanted a paper because they thought that the community needed a reliable source of news. It was purpose before profit. And I think that is the same 200 years later. It's not that there was a shortage of newspapers in Manchester at the time. You could say, why did Manchester need another newspaper? I've put some of them there. There were others, more on the Tory side than the Whig side. And I think the interesting question is, why was it that the Manchester Guardian, there were so many titles there, doubtless with very talented people working for them, and yet one by one, they all failed, and the Manchester Guardian succeeded. And from the very start, there were lots of people wanting the Guardian to be different, to be a different kind of paper. And I think that's still true today. A lot of the criticism of the Guardian is people who actually want the Guardian to be a different kind of paper. And that's perfectly fair. And in the 1820s, there were lots of people shouting at the Guardian, saying they wanted it to be more full-throatedly radical. But I think the public service it considered the most important was what I mentioned before, just to bring order to knowledge, to report facts, to create a reliable bedrock of knowledge. And I think that was what they considered the public service that they were serving. The paper appeared on the 5th of May, 1821. The typography is partly explained by the fact that it was very difficult to print papers at speed and in scale. The stamp duty that you see there meant that the paper sold for 7 pence. So it was out of the reach of most ordinary people. It was not a mass circulation paper by any manner of means, and really you could say that it never has been until really the last 10 years. And that was a deliberate attempt by governments to put a tax on knowledge. They cared less about opinion. I think this is worth reminding ourselves that Cobbett produced a paper for twopence because so long as you didn't put any news in it, the authorities didn't think the opinion was worth taxing. It was facts that they feared. There was a long manifesto and a stand-up printing press, which required each sheet of paper to be printed on both sides. You could see why there wasn't a huge production of the paper, though each individual paper, it's estimated, was read by up to 30 people. They were circulated in coffee houses and read aloud. So an audience started developing quite quickly for it. And soon enough, there was enough advertising for Taylor to pay back the investors. So within about 3 years, the investors, who, as I say, were mainly nonconformists, mainly Unitarians, had got their money back, though there was no expectation that they would. And it's interesting reading a letter from Sophia Russell Scott, who was soon to marry John Edward Taylor. That's the unity of the Taylor and the Scott families, writing about their motives, that they were respectable and moderate persons, these people who funded it. Their view was public advantage. They were willing to take risk without wishing to have any share in the profits. And we heard a bit yesterday about the increasing philanthropic tendency to regard news as something that is an essential public service, and that is surfacing again in the last 10 years in Britain and beyond. Employee number one or number two, if you count Taylor as one, was Jeremiah Garnett. He was an experienced note taker and eventually editor. He knew about printing. But I think the next hire, or one of the very next hires, tells you about the Guardian's priorities, and that was a man called John Harland, who was hired from the Hull packet, and he had developed an extraordinary art of taking down shorthand. And I think there was a huge appetite during this period of great political turmoil to read the actual words of politicians. I think of Andrew Sparrow today writing in The Guardian, as extraordinary ability just to keep going. And so this business of Harland recording for 30 years on The Guardian, the great speeches that were going on, tells you again something about The Guardian's priorities. Yes, it was Whiggish. Yes, it was generally in favor of cautious reform and progress. But as Haslam Mills wrote in 1921, its politics, at least up to the 1880s, were studiously moderate and what he called opportunistic. But it attracted a very broad readership. By 1840, the paper was the leading paper in Manchester, the third biggest provincial paper in the UK, always disappointing to those who wanted more reforming fire and campaigning edge, but doing something really quite remarkable. So we jump, and we jump to the centenary. It's C.P. Scott, the nephew of Taylor, and his wife had edited, in the end, edited the paper for 57 years, ended up buying it. And in this famous essay, Comment is Free, Facts are Sacred, in 1921, he talks about this relationship between the business. This is where I get the title for today's talk. It's much more than a business. Of course, it has to pay its way in order to sustain itself. But he went on to talk about the influence of media, of a newspaper, its character. And then he wrote, it may make profit or power its first object, or it may conceive of itself as fulfilling a higher and more exacting function. I think I may honestly say from the day of its foundation, there has not been much doubt as to which way the balance tipped. Had it not been so personally, I could not have served it. So yes, the paper had to pay its way, but that was not what interested him. It was its power and influence. And on his 80th birthday, he talked about the paper as a public service. Then he went further and said it is a public utility service. And those words seem very modern to me. I think of reporting now, especially in a world in which there may not be a market for it, a traditional economic market for much news. We have to reframe accurate and reliable reporting as some kind of public utility service. It's as essential to a society as an ambulance service or a police service. And so that ability of Scott in 1926 to talk about a newspaper as a public utility service seems to me very profound. I'm just going to sketch in because the story of how the ownership developed is an interesting one. So there is C.P. Scott, who was the nephew of Sophia Scott, married John Edward Taylor. That was the marriage of the Scott and Taylor families. C.P. Scott's son, Ted Scott, became editor when Scott died in 1932, or just before he died. And then Ted Scott himself died the same year. And suddenly you had this, it was a financial peril to the Guardian that these two simultaneous burdens of death duties would have been crippling. And John Scott, Ted's brother, then took this extraordinary decision that instead of selling the paper to Northcliffe or Beaverbrook or the people who would certainly have bought it, that he would set up a trust. He gave the paper away for nothing. He could have been a rich man himself. He led what was called a Spartan existence for the rest of his life as business manager of the paper. And this almost unique thing, you're always taught as a journalist not to say anything is unique, but almost unique in the world of journalism, that a family give away. Just think of the Bancrofts selling out to Murdoch, or the Grahams selling to Bezos. Perfectly reasonable thing to do, but here was Scott giving away the paper. And its purpose is full of interesting words. It's to secure the financial and editorial independence. I think independence is a crucial thing about The Guardian. In perpetuity, a pretty striking phrase. It's a long time, in perpetuity. As a quality national paper without party affiliation. Again, I think some people want The Guardian to be of their party. I remember Tony Blair complaining to me that the Guardian, it was unfair that all the Tory papers, the Tory party could rely on papers. Why couldn't the Guardian just be a Labour paper? And you had to say, well, that's not the Guardian's history. You're talking about a different paper, not the Guardian. Remaining faithful to its liberal, small L liberal tradition, and a lot of talk about what that means, as a profit-seeking enterprise. So it doesn't. Has to make profits. It's not being driven by profits, but managed in an efficient and cost-effective manner. So that's quite a sort of meaty mission statement. And the way that it's worked out over the years is that the Scott Trust is the owner. If there were shares to be owned, the Scott Trust would be the sole shareholder. And you have these two sides of the business. On the left-hand side, the businesses that were run for profit, with the Guardian manager, the Guardian Media Group overseeing this. And for a long time, the Guardian was very reliant on profits from the Manchester Evening News. Of course, that became less and less so. And there's this extraordinary fortune in buying, as the Guardian tried to find other businesses that would support the main mission, and lucked out with a magazine called Auto Trader, which it managed to transition into an entirely digital product, and by 2014 created a £1 billion endowment, and the purpose of that endowment is simply to support the Guardian in perpetuity. So that is, again, no one has ever taken any money, no one has ever made a fortune out of the Guardian. All the money goes back into the journalism. And that, I think, is a pretty unique operating model. of these two businesses, one for profit and one for purpose. And you can see that pink line, which I'll talk about a little bit further, what it means to the editor and to the editorial staff, just to answer in to a body that is not commercial. There was a bit of a talk yesterday about how the Guardian is, just another corporate business. I don't think when you look at that slide, you can really say that. I'm sure there have been lots of business leaders of the Guardian who wish that it had been, but it is, I think, recognizably run for purpose. Now, here's the contrary view. That was James Murdoch in 2009 giving the McTaggart lecture, in which he ended with those words: "The only reliable, durable, and perpetual guarantee of independence is profit." And I think a lot of people in the room at the time thought, well, hold on a minute, independence from whom? Fox News is very profitable, but I don't think anyone who works for Murdoch is completely independent from the views of its owners. And that, of course, takes you to an alternative. You can have shareholders who own newspapers, and you can have proprietors. And in this country in particular, of course, a lot has been written about what it means to be owned by a proprietor. And I think as money becomes less of an issue or of a motivating factor, then I think we're entitled to ask, well, what is the imperative? Why would people want to own a newspaper today if it's not about making money? And the suspicion is that some of these people you see there have got ambitions for political power. It seems to be in our funny constitution that you can get a seat in the House of Lords if you own a newspaper. Some maybe wanted to promote their business interests. Some enjoy having cozy discussions about planning applications. But it's a problematic, it can be a very problematic form of ownership. If you don't have a proprietor, and this has not been written about so much, how does that affect how a newspaper is run? That is what decision-making at The Guardian can look like at its best. That's a discussion before a general election with the staff, in which we also consulted readers. And that was, Gary Young talked last night about the morning conference. That was the morning conference in King's Place, in which anybody from the staff could come along and talk about the mistakes they thought we were making, the lines we should be taking, the things we should be reporting. And it was a place at its best of challenge and discussion. Of course, it also leads to the danger of groupthink, but the responsibility is to decide for ourselves. There's no one above us telling us what to think or what line to take. So that's a sort of basic idea of the structure and I think the origins. And I'm just going to highlight three stories where I think this ownership model really mattered, where the editor and the staff were free to take unpopular stances, even at the short-term risk to the commercial standing of the paper. So the first was the Boer War, the second was Suez, and the third was the Snowden affair. Each story illustrates, I think, either how the Guardian has struck it out on its own and been the outsider in the pack. I think probably all three demonstrate that. It's always had this outsider status, coming first of all from Manchester and having a different kind of ownership. It's never actually situated in Fleet Street. It's always been, I think, viewed with suspicion by Fleet Street. But the ownership structure really matters. So the first was we talked earlier about Scott and his attitude to empire and roads. And the official history of the Guardian by David Ayers says that what happened between the Diamond Jubilee in 1897 and the end of the Boer War in 1902 nearly killed the Guardian. A little picture there of Emily Hobhouse, who was sent out to do extraordinary reporting on the concentration camps that the British had set up in the Boer War to house the farmers and the families who had been driven out of their homes. That led to the police having to guard the offices of the Manchester Guardian and guard Scott Holmes itself. And although it nearly killed the Guardian in the short term, I think in the end, the Guardian benefited from this ability to stand out from the crowd and take brave decisions. It was the same in reporting on what we would think of war atrocities now, when the revenge trip to avenge the death of General Gordon led to British troops looting, extraordinary picture of the looting going on, and decapitating the body of the Mahdi, the religious leader who had been involved in the killing of General Gordon, to bring his head back to Britain as a trophy. The Guardian wrote about this, was excoriated. This was being unpatriotic. It is, funnily enough, its only vocal ally was a young Winston Churchill. It's thought that Queen Victoria also supported the Guardian, though she didn't say so at the time. But it was Scott's stance against public opinion and his ability to do it in the face of financial ruin. Similar kind of thing, a new editor in 1956, Alistair Hetherington, immediately saw that Suez was a catastrophe. Virtually the whole of the British press, with one or two honourable exceptions, backed the British government. It was a great humiliation for the British government. And it's very, again, striking. It's always lovely to go back and look at the physical editions. And in looking for the famous editorial that Hetherington wrote, there, earlier in the paper, are tributes to A.P. Wadsworth, the editor who had died that very day, and the seamless transition from one editor to another. And Hetherington steps in and writes this leader in which he says this is an act of folly without justification in any terms but brief expediency. And another historian of The Guardian, Geoffrey Taylor, said, well, yeah, if it was St. Crispin's Day at The Guardian, for many of the readers, of the traditional readers, it was a day of shame. And Lawrence Scott, the chairman, went to see Hetherington to say, I had to tell you that we're getting very alarming reports from our circulation managers about people just dropping The Guardian. Again, an act of unpatriotic duty by the Guardian. And actually, in the end, the circulation bounced back. And it, again, like the Boer War, this turned actually readers to The Guardian. But Scott told Hetherington, don't let the figures influence your judgment. And again, it's interesting to think in a world of metrics, if you don't use metrics well, that ability to understand that sometimes, I think it was Tina Brown who coined the phrase, you have to bite the hand that reads you. You have to sometimes stand out against what you think is the short-term reaction to a story and take a long-term view. And the third was, again, in view of some of the comments yesterday about the security state, this was our reporting in 2013. I think the burnt out destroyed hard drive that you see there on circuit board, which we destroyed under the watchful eyes of GCHQ because Jeremy Hayward had come to see me to tell me that the British government was not going to put up with our reporting for much longer. So rather than stop reporting, I transferred all the material to the New York Times, and we simply reported from America, where that kind of reporting has more protection. And I was then called in to give evidence to a House of Commons inquiry and asked whether I loved my country. Same question for Scott, same question for Hetherington. And there was a deputation of parliamentarians who demanded to see the GM board, the GMG board and the Scott Trust, and said, stop him, you've got to stop your editor. And both of them were able to shrug and say, look, we literally have no power. We have no power. The Guardian editor may not make profits, but he has plenty of independence, and there is nothing we can do. Talking of money, The Guardian has been talked about the life, the death experiences. That was Engels, who was a contributor to the Guardian in 1858, one of the crises. The paper has collapsed completely. Probably the greatest crisis was in 1966, again featuring Lawrence Scott. He was convinced that the Guardian was losing about $21 million a year, 18 million pounds. And he thought that the move to London had been catastrophic and it simply couldn't survive, and began negotiations to merge the paper with the Times. And again, the editor at the time, Hetherington, and Richard Scott, the son of Ted Scott, got to hear about this and scuppered it. And again, it was the editorial imperative that won the day, the incompatibility of the Times, which was the establishment newspaper, and the Guardian, which was the outsider. It was impossible to imagine how you could merge these papers. Salvation, as I said, came, there was a steady stream of support from the Manchester Evening News and from Auto Trader, a brilliant build-up by my predecessor, Peter Preston, and Peter Gibbings, Jim Markwick, Caroline Marlin, Caroline McCall, some very talented commercial managers who built up a huge head steam of classified advertising. By 1992, the paper had 41% of the market in the UK. But of course, the moment the internet happened, we realized that was doomed. And the last time the Guardian itself made a profit was in 2004. How were we going to finance the Guardian in this new era? I remember the day in 2012 when we had a conference of Guardian readers. We invited them into the building and had a kind of sort of festival of Guardian-esqueness. And the great academic Clay Shirky flew over for the event. And at one point, he turned to the readers and said, look, you've got two options. You're going to have to pay something. So you can have news as a private good. I pay so that I can read it, but someone else can't.
We're very sorry, everyone. We're trying to fix this now. Hopefully, Alan will be back with us very soon. There's been some great questions coming up on the chat box, so please do keep them coming. And I'm trying to collate them all and begin having that conversation as soon as possible so we can get as many of those in. But let's see if we can get Alan back. And hopefully something will happen very shortly. I think we're getting lots of nice questions coming through around again, how purpose is being defined. Oh, here he is, he's back. Are you with us, Alan? Can you speak so we can hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can, yes, great. Could you maybe go back?
When did you lose me?
I think it was 2 slides before.
Did you get the Clay Shirky bit?
We got the start from Clay Shirky.
Okay, all right.
You might have to upload your slides again, though. There we go. Yeah.
Okay,
we're there. We've got you.
Okay, so this was simply the poll, the readers' poll that said people would prefer to have news, The Guardian, as a public good, so that everyone could read it. And I won't labour this point, but this has led to remarkable results with £69 million coming in from something that could be read for free. And when you ask, well, what were people paying for? I think these were the kind of stories that people thought, well, if The Guardian is going to do this kind of journalism, we'll pay for it. Nick Davis, top left, phone hacking. Top right, Andy Coulson going to prison. The middle at the top, the Guardian's revelations of how a news seller was killed at the G20 protests, as opposed to the story that the police had put out that he'd had a heart attack. David Lee's reporting on BAE and the scandal around that. Aitken going to prison, Sleaze, Snowden, WikiLeaks, torture and rendition, slavery. This kind of investigative reporting, which, of course, a lot of papers just think this is too expensive to do. I think the truth is that public purpose reporting actually became the business model, because people said, if you're going to do that kind of reporting, we will support you in it. And you can see it today under my successor, Kath Weiner, saying these are the kind of stories that we can do if you support us. And it places The Guardian in a tradition of papers and media organizations. The Texas Tribune is a marvelous organization that employs about 70 people and just does this kind of public service reporting. And in America, they've now set themselves up as a philanthropic organization. And this, I think, plays into all the discussions that are going on at the moment about sustainable businesses, about the business case for purpose, putting purpose before profits, and how purpose is the clue to sustainability. And again, if we think about the 200-year story, that is where it comes to. I'm going to end with this man, Graham Wood, who is an Australian tech entrepreneur. In 2013, Malcolm Turnbull, who was not yet Australian Prime Minister, rang me in a state of alarm at the Australian media. Much of it was owned by that man, Rupert Murdoch. And the bit that Murdoch didn't own was about to be owned by Gina Rinehart, one of the richest billionaires in the world in the iron ore business, a huge climate skeptic. The question was, well, why does she want to control that? There were the strange man, Christopher Monkton, who's a climate change denier, said, well, obviously what we want to do is to capture the media. And so Malcolm said to me, please help. I said, we can't help. We can't afford to move into Australia. He said, well, what about if I found a philanthropist? And Graham Wood stepped forward. The deal was the same as with the original founders of The Guardian. I'll give you the money. If you make a profit, you can pay me back. And here, The Guardian Australia has been in the profit for the last 3 years. It employs 76 journalists. It's got a considerable foothold in Australia now. And it does remind me of what happened 200 years ago when those founders stepped forward. Their view was public advantage. They were willing to take the risk without wishing to have any share in the profits. And I think to end where we began, I like that story because it takes us back to the idea of having it in trust, the purpose always being central. Of course, The Guardian can always be annoying, smug, irritating. Some people think it's in politically the wrong place. But I think as news organizations start to think about purpose, sustainability, it's one model because it refocuses on the public service of journalism. And as long as readers continue to support it, and it does journalism that answers to that idea of public service, I think it will go on being financially sustainable. Its celebration, its 200th birthday is quite something to mark. And I'm hoping that it will still be here in another 200 years. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was incredibly interesting history up to the present day. There's heaps of questions that have been coming in. Apologies to everyone for the technical hitches again. We've only got a quick 10 minutes for questions. So I am going to start by, in really no particular order, but I'm just going to start by giving you a batch of 3, Alan, if that's okay. From Priya Gopal starts with, you spoke a lot about purpose at the beginning of the talk in particular. And she says, the question though is what the purpose was, even given the lack of a profit motive. Facts, yes, but surely also contextually, the emergence of liberalism as a force responding to both pressures from below and channeling energies in reformist, gradualist and constitutionalist directions, I can't say that, bringing order to facts is not an ideology-free process. So it's not a criticism necessarily, but the demand there is to historicise Guardian's emergence in a political scene overlapping with the rise of English liberalism and what the consequences of that might be for the Guardian we have now. Secondly, Theo Caloris' question says it doesn't question the Guardian's commitment to the purpose of reporting the facts, which is a perversive term in your lecture, but wonders what its role in the current historical juncture is. He said it may sound naive, but given its current and I should think increasing reliance on subscription revenue, how likely do you think it is that the Guardian may align with a more radical purpose? And by radical here, he's talking about a more comprehensive alignment with an egalitarian imaginary. So not necessarily political party, but on the left in an egalitarian manner. How likely is it that the Guardian can embody these ideals of the left? And they're 2 big questions, actually, so maybe we'll just start with those first.
Well, look, I'm not a political historian. I've emphasized facts today because I think that's a terribly contemporary problem. I think living in a world in which we don't know what's true and what's not. A recent study showed 2/3 of people now no longer know who to believe. So I think facts and you can imagine living through COVID at the moment without knowing who to believe, or imagine going through a period of climate change without knowing what to believe, or having a legal system, or not knowing what happens with the police. I mean, I shouldn't have to emphasize this, but actually there's I think if your only public purpose was to establish a reliable basis of what happened, that would be sufficient justification for public service. Of course, there's always then the political background, and I'm not saying that the Guardian has not sought to have tremendous influence, and has had, I think, tremendous influence. I mean, I do know that movement from Whiggism to liberalism, some people thought the Guardian was the defining engine of debate and change. And of course, as the Labour Party came along and began to eclipse the Liberal Party, the Guardian 100 years ago was caught between these two traditions, and some people would argue it still is. I do think I think this business of transferring ownership to the Guardian, at one point we did think of actually exploring whether you could mutualize it. Maybe addresses the question of the sort of egalitarianism, and it's a delicate thing because, as I say, sometimes you have to bite the hand that reads you. But I think it's an interesting model, and one that could apply to a number of news organizations, including, I would say, the BBC.
But you chose not to do that. And I do think that's an interesting question, because if you were going to put public purpose before profit, then surely kind of mutualizing would have given a very different ownership structure and would have put the public right in the center of what you were doing. So why was that decision made not to mutualize at the time?
I think it was just too radical. I mean, I think the majority of the Scott Trust thought, well, look, actually, this seems to work quite well. We're riding these two horses. We've got the profit bit and the purpose bit. We are the bridge between the two. And I think there was a fear amongst some trustees that how do you stop being captured by the readers? And so this was maybe 10 years ago that we had these discussions. We looked at Barcelona and some of these John Lewis and these things that have successfully mutualized. I would think that the discussion will come back at some point in the future, but maybe it was just too ahead of its time at the time.
There's also in your talk, you made a big play really about separating out purpose and profit. And there's a question that kind of asks whether that really was as distinct as you're saying it is. It's Rosie Brocklehurst asks, I remember asking Roger Alton in the late 70s why The Guardian had run an advert about some wonderful Latin country to visit while running a report about the brutal excesses of its military leader in another part of the paper. I recall clearly his reply, the one pays for the other. So do you agree that thinking prevailed at The Guardian then? And what are your thoughts around things like native advertising now? Surely that obscures the sorts of ideas you're talking about in terms of public purpose and distinguishing facts from everything else.
I mean, it's always been true. I think it's always been true on broadsheet newspapers that the readers have never paid. The advertising has been what has sponsored it and made it possible. And somebody once said it was Walmart that paid for the New York Times Baghdad bureau. No way that a newspaper could afford $2 or $3 million a year that it would cost to keep people in Baghdad. And as long as you had Chinese walls, so that there was no question that the advertising ever influenced the newsroom. Sadly, that has not always been true on all newspapers recently. Then it kind of worked. Some people refuse to believe that and believe that on a kind of meta level, the newsroom cannot be free of political advertising, of political influence, commercial influence. I myself didn't feel that. The two questions. One is, is there any advertising you shouldn't take? That's a difficult one for editors, because the moment you start saying, well, we like this advert but not that advert, then you're kind of breaching that Chinese wall. So if you're saying, well, we don't want to advertise holidays or cars or things that we don't like, or this bank, or the advertising, you're starting to blur the difference between advertising and editorial. And native advertising, I think, if not done right, is problematic because clearly the advertiser is hoping that to feel like editorial. And so I think you have to have very firm rules in place. I think we did at The Guardian. I'm sure they do now, but I have seen examples of native advertising. I wrote something about this recently, and I spent a couple of days looking at quite a lot of it and thinking, actually, I'm not sure that I can tell. And I was an editor for 20 years. So I think that the danger is there with native advertising, that it can be a slippery slope.
We are virtually out of time, but I'm going to ask one final question because it leads nicely into one of the next sessions we have running. This comes from Liz Mizon, and she asks, given The Guardian's persistence and huge achievement in breaking the phone hacking story, so this goes back to the stories that you said were most attractive to your readers, what was behind the decisions to, one, retreat from an independent regulation process post Leveson, and two, retreat from pursuing Leveson Part 2? And I know you weren't necessarily edited in the latter part, so but
not necessarily. I wasn't editor, so I mean, I was in favour of Leveson Part 2. I thought that was it was a commitment. It was from David Cameron, and it should have happened. There was a problem, I think, with Ipso in demonstrating that Ipso was demonstrably independent, and that's why we didn't join Ipso. But there was a really messy period in which the discussion about regulation had been commandeered really by a small group of newspaper executives, and the carrots that were supposed to be in place to tempt people into the Leveson compliant form of regulation, I think were botched. So they were really saying, if you come into this form of regulation, we will give you the legal protection from the really awful libel laws that we had at the time. And all the Fleet Street lawyers I knew said, well, actually, this has been mishandled. So I think if you were going to try and have something that was Leveson compliant, you would have to address those carrots as well as the sticks.
Alan, we're out of time. There's lots more to be said on that subject. So those of you who are interested in phone hacking regulation that followed on from it, please join the session on regulation in the state next. But for now, please join me in saying a huge thank you to Alan for giving up his Saturday morning, coming along and telling us in great detail and with very illuminating all of the details about the 200 years of the Guardian newspaper. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.